Great. And you have a PowerPoint, I believe.
Yes,
Is that
yes, and
correct?
I think, whoever is at the helm has already enabled me to share, so thank you kindly.
Excellent.
Okay, let's see here, full screen. Can everyone see a little presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Um, so thanks again. I'll try and move relatively swiftly through this, although we do also want to make sure to share the details of the plan with you all tonight. And then obviously we have ample time for questions and answers. And as Chris and Sarah said, hear your feedback and then take any questions. So we all work for the Trust for Governors Island, as you heard. It is worth taking a minute to just explain what that is. The Trust for Governors Island is a 501c3 not-for-profit that was created by the City of New York in 2010 for the sole purpose of taking care of Governors Island and making sure it's an extraordinary resource for New York City residents. And so while we're not an agency and we're not part of the civil service, we obviously are very closely related to the city. And again, we just sort of live and breathe Governor's Island day in, day out. We all even work out there, so get to enjoy the island year round. We wanted to start just with a quick update on the 2020 season, which was, of course, a challenging year for all of us, but we were really proud of how the island came together to make sure that this resource was available to folks from across the 5 boroughs. We set about planning for the 2020 season, really focusing on 2 principles. First and foremost, of course, health and safety, which was top of everyone's minds and remains top of everyone's minds as we continue to grapple with COVID. And then second and parallel to that, really centering equity to make sure that Governor's Island could be a resource for New Yorkers who needed it most this season. So what we did in preparation for that is we started a new ticket reservation system for the island, which allowed us to make sure we had the appropriate number of people on any given ferry to ensure adequate social distancing. And we also, via that mechanism, expanded our free ticket categories. We've always had free tickets for IDNYC holders, for former and current military personnel and kids under 12. And this year we added NYCHA residents and then seniors 65 and older. We also this season, as I'm sure many folks on this call are aware, redirected Brooklyn Ferry service from the foot of Atlantic Avenue to Red Hook. And we do outreach every year, but we really redoubled, tripled those efforts in this season to make sure to reach out to community groups adjacent to both the Red Hook ferry, but also our ferry stops at Lower Manhattan and at Pier 11, and just to spread the word as far and wide that this resource was available for folks who'd been starved for green space and just needed someplace to go this season. So we were very proud that between mid-July and end of October, we welcomed over 200,000 visitors. Of those, over 40% of the trips were free, and 99% of New York City zip codes were represented. So a truly New York audience. There we go. Some shots from the season, folks enjoying sort of safe, socially distanced activities. We did keep open food and vending services, made sure that each one of those vendors had a health and safety plan in place, and we kept open concessions that allowed for outdoor activity like the bike rentals. But obviously this season we weren't able to support events or indoor exhibition space. Although that sort of brings us to our next update from the 2020 season, which is that we were able to reposition the Nolan Park houses and the Colonel's Row houses to be able to benefit the artistic community in New York City this year. In a normal year, we open these houses to nonprofits across the city to provide events and public programming. So we came together with that community of nonprofits and Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and changed the entire slate of programming to offer free artist residency space for New York City artists who were in some way impacted by COVID, either because they lost their studio space or had lost income or were impacted in some other way. We were really happy to support over 120 artists this year working in those spaces. And for many, it was really a lifeline and a chance to be able to continue their practice during an extraordinarily challenging season. A little bit of a snapshot of some of the folks participating. You'll see here that, it's a mix really from across the 5 boroughs, Manhattan organizations, Bronx organizations, Brooklyn organizations, of course, and really spanning the artistic community, environmental, and also public engagement and youth activities. This year, a little bit more of a deep dive on the visitorship we received. As you can see, you know, uh, hail from all over parts of the city, about 40% road free. And we had a mix of first time and returning visitors. So we always work every year to attract new visitors to the island and make sure that this resource is being shared widely. A bit of a density map. Again, you can see here some of the parts of this community board were very well represented. The darker blue is a higher density of visits. And here we show the top 10 neighborhoods that came to the island this season. So diving into the topic at hand in today's conversation, we do always like to start with the history just because it's such a rich part of the island's fabric and I think really helps to understand where we are today. But prior to 1800, the island was primarily used as a hunting and fishing camp for the Lenape. From 1800 to the mid 1960s, it was utilized by actually the US Army. A lot of folks think it was the Navy, but it was the Army who was there. And the island formed a key part of the harbor's strategic defense system. And then from the mid 60s to the mid 90s, the US Coast Guard occupied the island. And what's interesting about when the Coast Guard was there is that the island really functioned as its own self-sustaining little neighborhood. There were about 3,000 people who lived on the island day in, day out. There were 14-story barracks buildings. They had a Burger King, a bowling alley, schools, everything you would need to be on the island 24/7. But as part of, sort of federal facility consolidation, the Coast Guard left in 96. And there was a long conversation and a real history of advocacy in the New York City community about what are we going to do with this island and how do we get it back to the people of New York? So finally, in 2003, the island was sold by the federal government to local government. We welcomed our first public visitors in 2005. And then in 2010, the island was transferred to full control by the city and the Trust for Governors Island was created. Rick, as you mentioned at the top in 2013, the northern part of the island was rezoned, but the southern half was not touched at the time because there were not yet plans in place for what to do with the southern half of the island. So 2010 was, a sort of banner year for Governor's Island in the sense that it came back into city hands, the trust was created, but it also was the year that the master plan for the island was created. And so what you can see here is the full master plan for the island, which really detailed out all of the design for the open space on the North Island, the full South Island Park that we all know and love today. And then it allocated these two sites here on the southeastern part of the island and here on the northwestern part of the island as development zones, areas to do future ground-up construction, which really was for two main purposes: helping to activate the island on a 24/7, 365 basis, and also helping to create a path to financial self-sufficiency for the island. The park itself was designed with resiliency and sustainability really built into every single design decision that was made. And the park was given primacy of place with open area along here with views of the Verrazano Bridge and the Statue of Liberty in Lower Manhattan, and a lot of thought to how shade and other wind, solar issues would be impacted as the development zones were constructed over time. So, what we like to say is since 2010, a huge amount of progress has been made on the island. I grew up in New York City and I had never been to nor heard of Governor's Island before going out there maybe in 2008. And it was a different world. There were all these abandoned buildings left by the Coast Guard. There was no running water. You couldn't use your cell phone, no sewage system, no electricity. And so you flash forward to today with $400 million of investment, this fabulous park, infrastructure in place. We've built out these fantastic educational and cultural partnerships. I'm sure many folks in this group are familiar with the Harbor School, whose home is on the island. It's just a fantastic public CTE school in the city focused on careers in marine biology and maritime technologies. And we've grown our audience from 8,000 a year when we first opened to nearly 1 million visitors in 2019. And I think today, unlike when I was a kid, you'd be hard pressed to find someone in New York who hadn't come out to the island on a trip at some time. In addition to the park, obviously we have the job of keeping the island running, keeping it well maintained, taking care of the beautiful historic buildings on the northern part of the island. Today, opening the island about 6 months a year only, it costs about $20 million on just an operating basis to run the island. Of that, approximately 75% comes from the city of New York, and the other 25% comes from a range of different earned revenue sources. And it has long been the goal to get Governor's Island to a point of financial self-sufficiency. It was contemplated at really dating back to the transfer from the federal government to the city, contemplated in the deed, and has been part of the master planning efforts since that point. So thinking about all the extraordinary momentum, how fantastic Governor's Island is, what a resource it is for city residents, we've thought a lot about what's the next step and how do we take Governor's Island and continue to expand on its potential and continue to open it up on a year-round basis to city residents, expand programming, and just generally make sure that the island is really an integrated part of the city's fabric. Since the last presentation we made to you all, we wanted to just flag a few things that have changed. At that time, we got a lot of questions from this group about what's the vision, what's the plan behind this, what's going to go into the zoning envelope. So we're going to share some of that tonight. How are we going to activate the historic district? And we have a real estate strategy for that, which, as Chris said, he and I are happy to take questions on at the end. And then also sharing all of the further details and changes to the South Island rezoning that's proposed. So, thinking through what are the objectives we're trying to achieve, we worked with our Community Advisory Council. Community Board 6 is on our advisory council as well, to establish 6 key criteria for how we think about development on the island going forward. As I mentioned, we're always prioritizing making this year-round public destination. We're trying to establish a path to financial self-sufficiency. But we also want to do something on the island that actually celebrates the unique and fantastic asset the Governor's Island is. Its waterfront location, its fantastic ecology, its historic value. And so really thinking about what could we put here that you can put elsewhere, somewhere else in the city. We've heard consistently through this process wanting to see a diversity of users and not a single monolithic user, expanding opportunities for public engagement, and then maintaining access and affordability for all New Yorkers. And Governor's Island is a place you can go today with your whole family and not spend a dollar. And that's something that has to be core to what we do going forward as well. Coming out of that conversation and some of the strategic planning, we've developed a strategy that really focuses on 3 key pillars. First, continuing to maintain and expand the open space and recreational opportunities on Governor's Island, making sure that it's always a fantastic place for biking, that we continue to expand the park, that we provide additional space for play fields and lawns and areas for kids to play. Arts and culture, which has been a huge part of what has made Governor's Island successful to date. There's still more we could be doing to support arts organizations in the city, creating space for artists, and really providing more of a canvas for public art itself. And then third, and a lot of what is driving some of the thinking in the rezoning, is this idea of developing a center for climate solutions. All of which, when we think about those 3 things together and we think about adaptive reuse of the buildings on the North Island and new develop on the South Island, help us to create this path to financial self-sufficiency that will enable the trust to expand to year-round public access, maintain and continue to operate the island top-notch, reactivating the historic district, and of course, increasing public programming as well. So before we dive into the Climate Center, I wanted to also focus a little bit on the existing tenants on the island and the historic district activation strategy. Today, we're home to 4 year-round tenants: the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council Arts Center, which opened last fall, the Harbor School, which I mentioned earlier, located right here, has students from across the 5 boroughs, Billion Oyster Project, which is located in this building and partners with the Harbor School. And then under construction now is the QC Terme Spa and Resort, which will be in these 3 buildings here. We've also focused on reactivation of additional buildings on the North Island, really thinking through what buildings are best positioned to come back online, because most of the buildings on the North Island need a huge amount of work to bring back to life, and thinking about use groups that align with those 3 strategy pillars and that are in key locations on the island. So one thing that we have on the docket, and we recently released an RFP for, is a Nolan Park Arts and Culture Campus. We starting with these 2 buildings, Building 20 and Building 9. In March of this year, we released an RFP looking for nonprofit tenants in the arts and cultural community to inhabit these spaces as year-round tenants. In October of this year, we released an RFP for Building 301, which is right at the foot of Yankee Pier. For those of you who've taken the ferry service from Brooklyn, it's right at that ferry stop, really focused on creating a green incubator and really commercial office space for tenants who are working in green technologies, blue technologies, who are nonprofit advocacy organizations, but beginning to foster this further foster this community of actors in the climate space. And really importantly, that is meant to help us jumpstart this idea of establishing a Center for Climate Solutions on Governor's Island, a project that was announced this fall. The key components of this idea are really about bringing together an interdisciplinary community on the island, creating a truly sort of cross-sector approach to climate solution making, and thinking about centering issues of equity and environmental justice into those conversations and into the programming and education that will happen on the island in the future. Over the past year, we've been doing a lot of research on this topic, went out and asked experts across the country, how can we contribute? And when you think about Governor's Island and the climate field, what's needed and what comes next, and how could Governor's Island play a role? And we heard a few key themes emerge. First, which I just mentioned a moment ago, is this idea of interdisciplinary work, and that climate science has advanced so significantly, but we need to bring those hard sciences alongside social sciences and behavioral sciences, communications, law, journalism, so that we can really blow out the field and begin to see innovations that affect the way all of us behave and the way governments and others allocate resources. A need for a real public showcase point, a place where we can demonstrate what truly resilient and sustainable urban communities can look like, and what better testbed than Governor's Island for that kind of idea. A place for center of gravity where we can bring together a cross-sector community to talk about and elevate these issues. Establishing a pipeline of talent and technology, very relevant to New York City, and we already have a lot of that in place with the Harbor School there. And then a real need to focus not just on the science and mitigation parts of the climate equation, but also on adaptation. And how do we think about putting things in place for existing communities that are going to have to adapt to climate change no matter what? Because even if carbon output dropped to 0 tomorrow, we're all still going to be living with these impacts. What we imagine that actually looking like on Governor's Island, as I said, is a mix of uses, not a single monolithic use. It starts with this idea of attracting a research or educational anchor, which we'll come back to in a second. There's room to do dorm and faculty housing, small scale convening and hotel, space for commercial businesses and nonprofits, and really all embedded in the living laboratory and cultural destination that is Governor's Island, so that when people come to the island, whether they're there for recreation, just to ride their bikes, whether they're there to see an arts exhibit, there's a point of entry for them and a way that they can engage with these topics and be exposed to new technology and innovations in the field. As I mentioned, our intent is to begin with a solicitation to attract an academic or research anchor to the space. There's a lot of different models that could be. It could be a degree granting university. It could be a university research or innovation center. It could even be an independent not-for-profit research center akin to Deltaris in the Netherlands. But the key there and what we're looking for is creating this institutional hub and bringing the broad range of activities under a single umbrella. Also a short deep dive on the idea of the living laboratory. We have such fantastic arts and cultural users already. Really the whole canvas of the island already sort of serves as a living laboratory. We have people like Billion Oyster Project and the Climate Museum who are out there and doing this work and engaging audience. And that could be expanded sort of limitlessly with everything that's happening on Governor's Island. And for us, one of the things we heard resoundingly in doing this research is that Governor's Island is a really unique place to do this, and in some ways, maybe the best place to do it, given the island location, given its location in the center of the harbor, and given the fact that it is truly a public space where the idea of being able to engage the public is authentic and right there. And we have these existing partners in place who are already doing it and proving that it is possible. In particular, as we, begin to move from restart to recovery for the city coming out of COVID, we believe this project could be very supportive in terms of both job creation and economic recovery, but also in terms of deepening the city's resilience. And it's something we've been working closely with the Mayor's Office of Resiliency on as well. And so how do we get there? And taking a few moments to focus on the proposed rezoning for the southern part of the island. We'll come to a map in a second. But basically what the proposed rezoning does is it takes the special district that exists on the North Island and extends it to cover the South Island as well. The idea of that is really to allow the use groups to align with the uses we're permitted in our deed from the federal government. It also creates protections for the existing park space, and it allows for an increase in developable square footage to about 4 million square feet, which is an FAR on the southern part of the island of approximately 3. As I mentioned, we have this deed from the federal government, which controls uses on the island. The zoning that we're proposing basically aligns zoning with those allowable uses. And then in the future, we'll release an RFP or an RFEI that further specifies preferences and priorities around design and other issues. So here's the map of the island. The northern part of the island was rezoned back in 2013 to allow for office, educational uses, cultural uses, retail establishment, restaurants, gyms, hotels, convening, a mix of uses, again, consistent with the deed. We're proposing extending those uses onto the southern part of the island, which have this legacy zoning of R32. Never really mattered for the Coast Guard because the federal government can override local zoning. But we have this legacy zoning in place that is inconsistent with what's allowable by the deed and with this vision for a mixed use, educationally anchored community going forward. The zoning will also establish sub areas in the southern part of the island, a western sub area with development allowed, an eastern sub area with development allowed, and then an open space sub area, which with controls in place to limit anything ever happening within the park area. The uses that would be allowed, again, are consistent with the North Island, but allow for light manufacturing and light research and development, again, in the spirit of supporting this climate center, which we expect to have an R&D component to it. We also worked with DCP and with the CAC and others to establish a series of design principles and principles for urban design to guide the zoning, really about complementing the park, connecting and establishing a harmonious relationship with the historic district, framing views, and making sure that there's connectivity between the park and the waterfront. As mentioned, the new zoning will create this open space sub area, which is mapped to cover the existing park plus unbuilt portions of the park, which we do expect to add in the future as funding becomes available. It creates a widened esplanade all around the perimeter of the island and creates a plaza here at Yankee Pier to greet guests as they're coming off of the ferry. And as you can see, it also creates primary connections up and through the development zones. Right now, these development zones are totally fenced off. And so if you're going along the esplanade, you can't get up into the park except on the edges. And this will create porosity in between the two. That's further shown here, where you also see the requirement to do secondary connections indicated in pink to further break down the development sites and ensure that there is a great deal of public access and interactivity among the different sites on the island. In terms of the zoning envelope, this is one potential massing for how buildings could be on the island. It is not the only one. And it is not a current design, but as folks in this committee will be familiar with, there's extensive controls in the zoning around base planes and base heights and setbacks, et cetera. But we wanted to flag here some of the key rules, which are heights, which will range from a maximum of 200 on these development zones to 230 here, and then 300 on these two zones. There are lot coverage requirements, which step down from 80% at the ground level to 30% at upper levels. And then there are extensive setback requirements that were really all created with the idea of preserving view corridors. There's also a transition zone in place in between the historic district and the development zones, which controls heights within this area to make sure that this part of the island is responsive to the existing historic buildings. And then as well, we wanted to share a series of 6 renderings, again, not official design, but really meant to show how one could use the zoning envelope to create this idea of a center for climate solutions. And I'll highlight here in particular the idea of a living laboratory, where you can see how a center could be created with testing and R&D, and that actually makes use of the waters and has public engagement, but as well a potential home for an anchor research or educational institution where we can center these activities around climate in the future. And then the last few things just to conclude before we jump into question and answer. Obviously, there'll need to be significant expansion of transportation access for this plan going forward. We really want to get to 12-month a year, 365 public access. We also hope to increase ferry frequency so that you don't really need to plan your trip to Governor's Island. You can just show up and hop on a boat. We are addressing right now issues of resiliency, and all future development in the island would be required, of course, to both meet and exceed requirements around raising up above the floodplain. What we really hope is that the island can serve as a demonstration about how to do this stuff in a way that's exciting and world-leading and cutting edge. And so that this really can become a hub for what is the latest and greatest in how we build our urban environments in ways that are sustainable and resilient. And that can include strategies that range from raising the site to dry proofing buildings to even experimenting with wet proofing and floating structures surrounding the island as well. From a sustainability point of view, obviously we want to make sure that in particular with respect to energy, the island is world leading. And so thinking through requirements and ideas around the types of building materials that can be used, passive shading and ventilation techniques, integrating sustainable energy sources, and then as well, really continuing to expand on this fantastic really ecosystem that has developed on the island and increasing green space there. So what comes next? Right now, we're doing 3 things in parallel. As Rick said, we're pursuing this rezoning for the southern portion of the island. We are continuing to invest in strategic planning to fine tune this idea and make sure we're issuing the most impactful possible solicitation next year. And also continuing outreach and marketing to potential nonprofit partners, educational partners, research partners for this. Further to that point, in terms of community engagement, both in the past, but going forward, obviously all of this has been the result of really years, maybe even decades of engagement with local elected officials, partners on the island, et cetera, even citywide engagement efforts. And we're going to continue that history as we prepare for the RFP. So we have established working groups within our Community Advisory Council focused on how we write and talk about the goals in the RFP, and then doing deep dives around opportunities for public engagement, around building equitable education and job pipelines, and then around design guidelines. So thank you for already having participated in some of these and for your willingness when called upon in the coming weeks and months as well. And so to conclude with a timeline, we certified it into the rezoning in October. As mentioned, we're in the outreach and planning phase now, and then at some point next year, we don't have an exact date yet, we are looking to release this RFP or RFEI that's specifically focused on attracting an educational or research anchor focused on issues of climate solutions. So thank you. I know that was a long presentation, but we did want to make sure we shared all the details and updates, et cetera. And I'll stop the share, but can always pull back up other slides for Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much. That's really helpful history and context. As you can imagine, a lot of the questions from CB6 participants and the broader community are about impact on Brooklyn.
Sure.
And both historically in terms of usage patterns of ferry ridership from Red Hook, and what's being contemplated both near term, since this is a long-term plan, so near term as well as long term in terms of the Red Hook ferry and base, particularly outreach within the NYCHA community, NYCHA residents of Red Hook, and any ridership data you have there. And then of course, since the south side and the series of buildings is closest to us, we would want to understand sort of the view plane, you know, any height impacts, given you're talking 23 to 30 floor buildings. So maybe if we could start with a ferry and talk about sort of ridership and community engagement there. Great.
Sarah, do you want to start by talking about our engagement and outreach around, in particular, the Red Hook launch, but really, I guess, for Brooklyn Ferry in general, year in, year out?
Yeah, sure. So as Claire mentioned, this year we made the decision to redeploy our Brooklyn Ferry service from Pier 6 to Atlantic Basin in Red Hook. And our ability to reopen Governor's Island really, we were able to do that only because we were able to limit the capacity on the ferries to allow for social distancing and whatnot. So we basically launched a ticket reservation system, which was new to us. You used to just go up to the ferry terminal, whether it was at Pier 6 or at the Battery Maritime building, and you could just show up and ride. So with that in mind, with that limited capacity, we really wanted to target our outreach efforts. So with the Red Hook outreach, first of all, Brooklyn Community Board 6 was very helpful. Mike, the district manager, I think spread the word in many of his newsletters and shared it with a number of board members. But we did direct outreach to Red Hook houses, to both Red Hook houses east and west, and worked with their TA presidents to help spread the word. We also partnered with NYCHA's communications team, who helped us distribute news both via social media and through some direct outreach. And then we really partnered with a number of community-based organizations in Red Hook. I'll particularly shout out the Red Hook Initiative, Good Shepherd Services, in Portside, New York, who really helped us spread the word and engage with local schools and help spread the word at different events and on social media, digitally, et cetera. So we were able to reach a lot of folks. You know, I think in a normal season, we have quite a long lead time for when we spread the word about Governor's Island reopening, and we were only able to do so, I guess, in the span of 3 weeks from when we decided and announced we're opening until when we opened. But thanks to a lot of those community partnerships, we really did reach a lot of folks, and we're able to see a lot of participation from Red Hook residents in particular on the ferries.
On the Red Hook, so do you have data, is it by zip code, or do you have more, which would be 11231, or do you drill down into, for example, knowing NYCHA residents?
So one of the nice things about this ticket reservation system is that we have clear data. Previously, we would do a survey of basically every 5th person in line for the ferry to ask their zip code. And now we have 100% zip code data, which is great. So beyond what we shared this evening, I'm happy to drill down a bit into the zip code data for CB6. But yes, we were also able to identify more demographic information about folks, both from the fare categories that they selected. And then we also administer a visitor survey by email. Visitors to the islands, when they receive their confirmation, will get a link to the survey. So this year we were actually able to survey a greater percentage of our visitors than we had previously, just because we were able to connect it to this ticket reservation system. So I know we provided some high level data here, but we're happy to drill down a little bit into CB6 data and share that with you all, just so you have it.
Yes, we would definitely like that. You know, I think we are particularly focused on NYCHA residents. Proportionally, it's highest population in Red Hook. It's about also across CB6, it's about, I think, 11-ish% between Red Hook and Gowanus houses. And so we're very, very focused on resources there. And so we would like to know at that level. It can, I know, be hard to sometimes get through sort of bureaucracy of NYCHA. So we appreciate the fact that you're doing that. So can you also, though, tell us what the future, like the next summer, for example, will the Atlantic Basin ferry stop be active? You know, what are you currently planning or committing to?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. We're working through all that stuff right now. You folks won't be shocked to hear that we, like other nonprofits in the city, are having a very challenging budget year and projecting budget year forward. But we are working through those questions at the moment, and hope to be figuring out all of the ferry service for next year and public season amenities really in the next few months. So, but happy to take feedback from this group about that tonight. You know, would love to hear from you all what the priorities are as we, you know, do our best to provide the best possible service with the resources we have allocated.
Right. Well, I think it would be fair to say that we are very supportive, encouraging of more services for Red Hook. And so, you know, that involves both the level of outreach, but also your efforts to activate year round and the hours and the frequency. So that's just clearly a
no, totally. Yeah, we're in wholehearted agreement with that, needless to say.
Yeah, one insight from this year that I think was helpful is for folks familiar with the Pier 6 service, we traditionally ran it every hour, except for the occasional peak weekend, whether there was a large event happening or it was a holiday. This year, we were able to run Brooklyn service every half hour, which I think, again, to Claire's earlier point, takes the planning out of the trip. So I think that's something we'll want to continue to look at. And honestly, just based on the sheer distance alone, one ferry was able to do quicker trips back and forth, which enabled us to expand that service.
Great. I want to open it up to other committee member questions. Our co-chairs for this committee are Ariel and Mark. So I don't know if you guys have questions, or we can just open up the floor to committee members, and then others who are not on camera can ask questions as well in, I think, either the chat or Q&A. Is that right? Tamara?
Yeah. And I'll take my cue from you if you want me to try and respond to the questions that are popping up in the chat, or if you want to go through the live ones first, Rick, however you want to run things.
Yeah, no, let's start with the ones that people have been adding in the chat.
Yeah,
so
Mark, I put my questions in the chat. So
okay, great. Thanks, Mark.
There.
Okay.
The first question I see here is how many artists were from Brooklyn? Sarah, do we know that off the top of our head, or would we have to get back to the group?
We will have to get back to the group on artist location. We did do some surveying of all the artists that participated in the residency program, so we can follow up with that. I will note that almost half of the organizations that participated are Brooklyn based, so I would suspect that it's a large number, but we'll get you that exact information at a later date.
So that outreach is both through nonprofits as well as individual artists, or the artists are through the nonprofits like LMCC or Brooklyn Arts Council?
So the way it worked this year, so traditionally with the houses in Nolan Park and Colonel's Row, we do an open call to organizations, and they basically use the house during the season for free public programming. This year, we wanted to honor our commitments to those organizations, but obviously weren't able to do public programming. So there was general consensus that folks wanted to do residencies to support the artists in their communities. So some folks did open calls that were publicized broadly, and then some organizations already had artists that they had been working with that they selected for those spaces. It sort of varied, primarily, frankly, because we stood this up pretty quickly without a ton of notice. But LMCC is a permanent tenant on the island. They run a year-round residency, and they typically do an open call that involves a lot of outreach to the 5 boroughs, not just serving Manhattan artists.
And then in terms of overall visitorship, this year, actually, like most years, Brooklyn was a very close second to Manhattan in terms of overall visitorship. They're really neck and neck on any given year. The next question I see here was outreach to NYCHA successful. I think we're happy with the efforts this year. Obviously, all of this stuff too is a constant learning process. And so I think we can take everything we did this year and improve it for next year. Sarah, do you have any particular metrics around that we can share, or anecdotes about NYCHA outreach? Yeah,
so Claire mentioned that about 40% of our overall visitorship took advantage of free ticket categories. I think overall about 14% of our visitors were from or were residents of NYCHA. We can get back to you all on sort of the breakdown. We did quite a bit of outreach in Lower Manhattan as well, Chinatown, Lower East Side, Two Bridges neighborhood. So we can get you a more specific breakdown there.
The next question I see here is, does Brooklyn have comparable ferry service to Manhattan? So in public season on the weekends, yes. Year round, no. Our primary service, like today, the only service is running from Lower Manhattan at the Battery Maritime Building to Swasson's Dock. The boat that we own is the Corson. It's the really big boat that can also carry vehicles. And so on a sort of normal weekday, we run that route from B&B to Swasson's, which accommodates the boat and accommodates emergency vehicles, construction vehicles if necessary as well. But we don't have weekday service to Brooklyn yet. As mentioned, obviously, we're always want to expand ferry service and public access. If at any point I don't fully answer someone's question, feel free to just shout out. How
Mark,
does
those were your questions. Did you have other clarifications there? Oh, can't hear you. Okay, why don't you go ahead, Claire?
Sure. How does South zoning envelope compare to North? So the North Island is very different because the reality is that the vast majority of what's going to happen there is adaptive reuse of the existing historic buildings because it is a landmark district. When we look at what's allowed on the South Island today, as a sort of different way to skin that cat or answer that question, the R32 zoning on the South Island today allows a range of square footage from 1.7 to 3.4 million. So the 4.2 is an increase above that 3.4 million. I should note that the proposed FAR of 3.0 does not include the park at all. So that's just the density in the development zones proper. I see a second question from Mark. Would you consider limiting height to 290 feet? I mean, the short answer to that question is yes. We're working, we did get comments from Community Board 1 in Manhattan about height and density. We're working through those comments now and will be over the course of the coming weeks and months. But we understand the concerns around those issues and are actively looking at ways that we can make changes to either height or density. I'm curious whether, sorry y'all, I'm curious whether any housing uses were considered. Does university housing have different requirements from permanent housing or other types of transient housing? Great question. So our deed from the federal government prohibits permanent residential on the island. So we have been contemplating things that are not permanent residential, which include dorm, faculty housing. We're allowed to do caretaker housing, like if a ferry service member needed to live on the island. And then as well, there is the potential for space for things in the nature of artist residencies or folks who are visiting to do research for a few months. So those are all uses that we do anticipate and that we're actively exploring and that are contemplated in this rezoning. Most of those have, I'd say, dorms have very different requirements than faculty housing for obvious reasons, but for the most part, they're within striking distance of each other. Sorry, it's a little hard to scroll through these. Okay. From Robert, will the max height allowed include allowances for the floodplain, or are they above the floodplain? Good question. So the city is currently proposing a citywide text amendment for zoning for coastal flood. Chris, I'm messing up the acronym. I can tell I am.
Resiliency, you got it right. Zoning for
Okay.
coastal flood resiliency.
Thank you. Thank you. So actually, this came up with Community Board 1 as well. The max height does not include the allowance for floodplain. So for example, if you, like the park was elevated maybe, it ranges but between 4 and 8 feet to get it out of the floodplain. So that's not part of the 300-foot calculation. And so as we contemplate comments on height and bulk, we're going to be accounting for both that and also the second part of your question, which is allowances for things like bulkhead or mechanical equipment that would be on the roof. That's right. Thank you, Dave. I'm not seeing any chat entries. Here are my questions from Q&A. The next question I see is from Glenn. Why was the ferry moved from Pier 6 to Red Hook? How did that affect the number of passengers? Thanks, Glenn. This year we made the move really in response, honestly, to the impact of COVID and trying to make sure that we were doing our part in providing access to green space for communities that are underserved by parks. And so honestly, a little bit of the logic was that if you made it to Pier 6, you're at Brooklyn Bridge Park. And in a year where we know folks just desperately needed outdoor green space, being able to serve the Red Hook community, which has less park space, particularly with all the construction that's happening, seemed like a way to contribute to the broader goals of the city to provide, again, relief to folks who didn't have as much access to green space. I don't think it affected passenger numbers, but because really every single Brooklyn ferry run was sold out and we were operating at the reduced capacity, it's impossible to totally do them apples to apples. But I would say that really all of the Brooklyn ferry runs this summer were sold out. So we were very pleased by the pickup and the responsiveness to the change in location. I see a question here. What are vehicle restrictions and is there an island bus loop? Great question. So the only people who can bring vehicles to the island are emergency service vehicles. So we actually do have an NYPD officer who drives one of those mini cars, the NYPD half cars out every day. Just by way of example, there's an ambulance that comes to the island during public season and just sits there in case something goes wrong. And then for tenants of the island, like some of the cultural users that Sarah mentioned, Pioneer Works needs to bring out a whole bunch of supplies for the house. They can drive a car out there, but you can't just drive on unless you have special permission related to a use on the island or an event or something of this nature. We don't currently have an island bus loop, but Council Member Chin last year supported the island with a grant to help us buy some electric trams. So we're going to look to stand those up and start operating them, in the next year. And basically what that will allow us to do is prioritize trips around the island for folks who have a hard time walking around the island. So older folks or disabled individuals. And then, to the extent there's still slots left, others. Also 300 feet, but yes. So the calculation on the overall density of development, there's a question here about why this amount of development. Really that stems from how much development would be required to help the trust achieve this goal of financial self-sufficiency. And then as well, there's been a long-standing planning effort on the island, really dating back to when the park itself was created, to essentially free up all the space in the middle and make sure that's green open space. That's the park we know. In addition to, there's some unbuilt portions of the park that are not included in the development zones that will remain park space. And so basically ensuring that we can achieve that square footage, but to the sides so that we have open space in the middle area.
Just a question there on the, someone asked about the calculus to make enough money. One of the core issues that came up with Brooklyn Bridge Park that you might be aware of was an issue about transparency of the financials, because the agreement was that it would only allow housing to the extent necessary for financial self-sufficiency, but there was resistance to disclose what that meant.
Sure. I'll let Chris jump in, but we didn't bring them tonight, sort of, we actually could pull them up because they're on our website, but we did present detailed financial information to Community Board 1 that showed how we modeled our rental revenue and all the other income, as well as how that compares to our operating expense and the need for capital repairs to the North Island buildings. But Chris, would you like to just maybe give a
Yeah,
short overview?
I'd just say the spirit of it was certainly similar to the modeling exercise at Brooklyn Bridge Park. I'd say where it differs is, even with all the uncertainty at different points that surrounded what the development value would be and how much costs would need to be at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Ultimately, you were talking about I think a smaller set of potential uses and residential, and off luxury residential space that was more knowable in Brooklyn Bridge Park, where, a lot of what we're valuing on the island is a zoning envelope, a mixed use zoning envelope where we want major cultural and academic institutions as anchors, where there's still a lot more, I think, capital investment and operation and transportation infrastructure investment than is required or was required for Brooklyn Bridge Park. And so, the methodology is similar and the spirit of it is similar, but, I think there's kind of a more assumptions inherently baked in. But what we did do was take a really extensive look at, first of all, our pro forma assumes all of the North Island historic buildings, which we're working to adaptively reuse and reactivate with kind of mission-oriented tenants. And then also the South Island zoning envelope that we're proposing as part of this rezoning. We looked at a broad range of ground lease comps, including from Brooklyn Bridge Park, Battery Park City, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, lots of other ground lease and transactions, mostly from public-private partnerships for all the different asset types that we're looking at on the island. We looked at appraisals. We looked at a pretty wide range of market information to really feel like we had kicked the tires on that. So that rental income, along with rental income from existing tenants, we do have some that are paying us rent now, as well as assumptions about our events revenue and ferry fees and all the other much smaller but important revenue sources that we have. That's then kind of juxtaposed against our operating expenses, which are a combination of all of the work we do to maintain the fabulous park. We provide our own security, EMT services. And we really actually act as a small municipality. We own all of the water, sewer, electric infrastructure on the island, so we have to maintain all of that. We pay for running the ferries, as well as maintaining all of the maritime infrastructure, the piers and piles in the water that you guys obviously know how expensive those are. So taking kind of conservative projections of what the expenses for operating the park and opening it 365 and growing it over time for many, many more users, as well as creating a capital reserve so that eventually we're able to self-fund. We're currently in the New York City's 10-year capital plan with city capital from OMB. The long-term goal would be that we're able to actually self-fund capital repairs as needed each year with a healthy or fiscally prudent reserve. So when you put the and then finally, I'll say we projected property tax revenues using the Department of Finance methodology, which we've reviewed with OMB. And when you put all those together and look at kind of what our first of all, our ongoing subsidy needs are just for our operations, and then also layering in our capital needs, we have basically a 20-year plan based off of this program for the South Island, plus our existing North Island buildings to get to operating self-sufficiency. And then it looks like another 10 years, about a 30-year plan to be fully financially self-sufficient. So as Claire mentioned, we have some detailed slides about on our website on that, which we can either look at now or talk through. But that's generally the the approach we've taken to pencil out a pathway to self-sufficiency for ourselves.
Thanks, Chris. The next question I see here is, what does the current zoning of the southern section allow? So the current zoning on the southern half of Governor's Island today is R32. So it allows for a combination of residential and community facility uses. As mentioned earlier, the deed from the federal government to Governor's Island prohibits permanent residential use. And so part of the intent of the proposed rezoning of the southern island is to allow for that mix of sort of commercial and community facility uses that mirrors what's on the North Island today. So it basically expands the allowable set of uses to encompass more of a mix of uses than just a pure residential zoning state of play. What are developers asked to contribute to the public good in exchange for the opportunity to develop on the island? That's a great question. Chris's sort of description of how we manage the island is a little bit related to that, in that a big part of what they're going to be asked to pay is common area maintenance and, of course, rent, which will enable us the trust to expand programming, expand public access, et cetera. But I would also say that a big part of what we're doing now over the course of the next few months and gearing up to releasing this future solicitation is specifically engaging with the CAC and other community partners to really figure out exactly what we'd like to see with respect to amenities and public engagement, so that we can prioritize those in these future solicitations. Certainly there's going to be improvements to the public realm as well that come out of this. How are rising sea levels expected to affect Governor's Island, and what steps are you taking regarding sea levels? So really the best example of that and how we approach that work is the park itself on the southern half of the island. When that was built over the course of really the last 8 years, resiliency was taken into account in every part of the design. So the whole park was elevated out of the 100-year floodplain. Materials from the demolition of the seawall were integrated back into the park itself. The curbs actually do double duty as wave attenuation. And so we expect to follow suit for that for the development sites and really ensure that the construction that's happening in those areas is taking into account both the existing 100-year floodplain and sea level rise. There's a lot of different techniques to do that, whether it involve raising, as the question before indicated, raising the building out of the design flood elevation, or whether there be a ground plane that's actually wet proofed. Those are the kinds of ideas that we would be working through with future partners in the development, but making sure that this is not just resilient, but an example of how to do resiliency well is a key part of what we're trying to achieve out here. Please describe the condition of the existing buildings and how much they are currently being used. Okay, so the North Island buildings, there's about 1.3 million square feet of space on the North Island under roof. Of that, 300,000 is occupied today. And within our sort of strategic plan for the North Island, we have another few 100,000 with plans afoot. For example, one of the buildings is being held for the expansion of the Harbor School. We have Nolan Park earmarked for a cultural campus. As I mentioned, we just released an RFP for Building 301, really looking to attract commercial entities and nonprofits who are working in the environmental and climate space. The buildings themselves really almost universally need a gut renovation. Because they were abandoned by the Coast Guard in '96 and had been in varying states of disrepair when the Coast Guard left. Construction dates back many, many decades. Really, they all need new plumbing, new HVAC, new electrical systems. For the most part, the roofs and the structures surrounding them are in good condition, but you'd be looking at pulling out the entire interior, putting in new systems and adding new white box. So it's not not a cheap proposition. However, obviously the care and restoration of the historic buildings is very important for the trust and for the island and for folks who visit the island. So we work very hard to keep those buildings stabilized until such time as we can attract users and do the renovation in the interior to make them appropriate for year-round use. Part of the
Just
reason. Oh yeah, please, Rick.
Well, no, on that point, building is at 400, the long one between the two, sort of north and south. What's the current status of that one and use contemplated?
Liggett Hall?
I think that's the one, the long.
Yeah. Liggett Hall is about 300,000 square feet. So it's a very big building. We're hopeful that as part of this future climate center project, it will be adaptively reused by a participant in that solicitation. But because it's such a large building, it's less of a candidate for sort of one-off early, it's not exactly low-hanging fruit, I would say. That said, in addition to these future RFPs, we are always entertaining proposals for leases or redevelopment, because again, we would love to get those North Island buildings back online as quickly as possible. Please describe, okay, yeah. Protecting the open space park space was mentioned. How will this be achieved? Okay. Is this parkland map New York City Park? What role will, if any, will the New York City Parks Department play? So really questions about how we maintain and ensure the protection of the park. So the trust for Governor's Island owns and manages the park. It's not mapped parkland. Today, it's actually just zoned R32. But one of the things we're proposing in this rezoning is to specifically zone the entire park as an open space sub area. And basically what that would mean is that the only thing that you could build in the park would be things like related to the park itself. So you could have a coffee kiosk. It would allow us to do an ice skating rink or a pool. It would allow us to do a small scale concession, things of this nature, but you wouldn't be able to develop the big commercial buildings within that space. That would only be possible within the development parcels themselves. So really and we did get comments on this from the community board 1 as well, and are working on tightening that part of things up so that really the things that would be allowed in the open space sub area mirror what's allowed in a park, in a traditionally New York City park that is mapped as parkland. This is a comment. It seems odd that the CB6 Parks and Recreation Committee was not informed of these changes. We would be happy, to come back at any time. We're committed to engaging with you all both today, but also as the island continues to grow and expand. So we'll take Community Board 6's lead on that. And again, happy to engage as much as possible. And as well through the CAC. I don't think it's the Parks and Recreation Committee specifically, but again, whatever channels you all think is appropriate for further engagement, I'm happy to do that. The amount of development planned is much more than required to maintain the space. What happens with the remaining funds? The amount of development planned, as Chris said, really gets us to just above break even. It's going to be a slow process, but we do expect to get to self-sufficiency on the operating basis by 2040, and then including a capital reserve by 2050. The 4.2 million proposed does give us a little bit of contingency. And as we informed Community Board 1, that number could be reduced to 3.7, which would get us to just exactly break even, no contingency, no cushion whatsoever. And Rick, this comes back to your point. We've been trying to share the financial information and the sort of break even numbers throughout this process. 300 feet about that one, I think I got. Oh, good. Allison is here from DCP. If there's any DCP questions, Allison, I could have had you help me on Zukfer. Is there a difference between, is there a difference between the capacity of the infrastructure work done and what may be needed with your plans? That's a great question. So as Chris said, we are currently in a 10-year capital plan with the City of New York. That covers the vast majority of the capital that would be needed to realize this vision. However, it is noted in the EIS 2 specific things that we would need and that we're starting to have conversations about with the city. One is a second water line to Governor's Island, and the other is an expansion of electrical services on the island. But otherwise, thanks to the significant investment that the city has already made, and as well in our existing capital plan, which includes procuring more ferries and rebuilding some of the pier infrastructure, we're in pretty good shape. Okay, I see a next question here from Sam. Have you considered prioritizing NYCHA connected job training programs for construction jobs? That's a great idea. As we continue to work on the RFP and think about the requirements we'd like to ask of developers, that's the sort of perfect place to include things like that. We do have robust sort of local participation goals and MWE participation goals, but we can definitely connect with, we know the folks who run the NYCHA construction job training program and are happy to connect with them. Thanks for that. Towards Manhattan, is there a shot of that in the current? Okay. Also, I'd like to see the new projected view shed towards Manhattan from Valentino Pier. Is there a shot of that in the current slide deck that I missed? I do think we have that. Hold on a sec. The location of, sort of short answer on that is the location of the development zones, the view from Valentino of the Statue of Liberty is totally unaffected. And we can show you the full view shed as well. Oh yeah, okay. Oh my God. Sorry, while I struggle with technology, here we go. Okay. View. Full screen. Okay. So here's Luis Valentino Park. The blue is the development zones. And so what you can see here is the straight line to the Statue of Liberty, Lower Manhattan as well. And this is Pier 6. This portion where the red is the part of the waterfront where views are obstructed today by the industrial waterfront there, which is why it's outlined in red there. Hopefully that helps. Water, are there beaches, freshwater supply, wastewater systems? Thank you, Judy. We don't have beaches yet. We do have, obviously a 2.5 mile waterfront. We would love to figure out ways to provide greater access to the water, whether that be a pool or whether that be actually like swimming in the water proper. Obviously, that's a very capital intensive item, but it is an area that we've heard a lot about from different community boards and also folks who visit the island. So something that's very much on our minds. Freshwater supply, we are supplied by fresh water from Brooklyn under the Buttermilk Channel. It's totally potable. And as I mentioned, we would need a second water line at some point in the island's development. That point is not yet. And then wastewater systems. The wastewater system is actually adequate to accommodate a lot of the projected growth, but some increase in the system may be necessary in the future. Chris, something I missed there?
No, I would just add that the waste would be handled on the island side. Like we're currently connected to the Red Hook wastewater treatment plant, but both their capacity and our connection is sufficient for full build.
Oh, and I should note too that our sewage line, we have a totally separate stormwater and sewage system on the island. The stormwater system that's in place is adequate for the full build. A question from Mark, do we have any pre-development commitments for the South Island? No, Mark. So we're going to do all of that via this future procurement process, this future RFP, which again, we hope to get out sometime next year. Although we have, been doing outreach about this idea and are confident that we will be getting responses related to the climate center. Where can one review evacuation plans in the proposed RFP? Good question. That's from Maria. Thank you, Maria. We don't have that developed yet, so the RFP is not yet written, but we can certainly share that once that's available. Sarah, we do have existing evacuation plans for the island. Do you want to touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, I'll just say that we work closely with NYPD First Precinct, NYPD Harbor Patrol, and the FDNY on all life safety matters. And obviously it's something that is of the utmost importance to us, but we have sort of detailed internal safety protocols when it comes to caring for visitors to the island, our staff, and then of course our year-round tenants.
Great. The next question is from Ariel. Can you talk more about the proposed uses plus the additional manufacturing type use mentioned? By what mechanism would uses be restricted? Is there concern about limiting uses before an RFP is out? What about industrial research in terms of testing and scientific research towards new materials, for example? Great question, Ariel. Chris, do you want to take a stab at that about the use groups and how that gets sort of adjudicated and restricted?
Sorry, for just the open space?
No, this is for the development zones.
Be restricted to current limit. Sorry. So, well, I think there's only a very specific uses that are R&D related or food manufacturing related that are currently in the proposed zoning text, and those all come with the performance standards that are in M1 zoning, the lighter manufacturing zones. So there's kind of distance requirements. There's pretty limited number of uses that even fall into that category. And then they have the most stringent performance standards for noise, vibration, dust, or any of those things, so that they could really be compatible in this kind of mixed use district.
We did carefully, Ariel, the other part of your question, carefully review in particular the sort of things that one would put into the R&D bucket. To make sure that those were in the permitted area, subject to, of course, the environmental controls that Chris enumerated, because we do want to make sure that we're able to accommodate good ideas around sort of climate-related research.
Yeah, and I guess the other part of that is just how do you do that before your RFP is ready in case ideas come in afterwards?
Yeah, that's always sort of a tricky balancing act. We obviously worked with DCP very closely on that. We have a great board of directors who have experience in this area. Of course, other advisors. I guess I have the benefit of having been at the Navy Yard for a while and having a sense of what types of use groups are needed for R&D type of uses. We making sure that folks didn't feel like there was too much exposure to things that could be viewed as noxious, while making sure that we were allowing for the R&D. We did have to sort of strike that balance, but we think we did that. I have a question here from Maria. Where can one review criteria for food vendors and other PT tourist visitor needs? Great question. we're actually just about to post all that on our website for the 21 season. Chris, could you tell folks how to get engaged with that and how to find the info?
Yes, it will be on the real estate section of our website. It's not up quite yet. It'll be, I think, up just in the new year. But each year we're very proud that we renew, and our vendors, so many of our food vendors are long-term small businesses that have wanted to come back year after year. But each year we do invite others to propose to come to the island. We want to make sure we have a really diverse mix of options from lots of different nationalities, lots of different price points, vegan, vegetarian, really, so that everyone can find something that works for them and their family in Liggett Court. But on our website, on the real estate section, we can make sure that when it's live again, we let everyone in our kind of universe know how to find it. We just ask for pretty limited materials about their business, what their menu would be, what their price points are, things like that. But definitely always looking for people from the surrounding communities. So would be excited to get more options next year.
One thing I'll add too is anytime we release an RFP, an opportunity for programming on the island, an opportunity to vend on the island, we send it to Mike, who is Brooklyn CB6's representative on our Community Advisory Council. So we'll make sure that he distributes those types of opportunities to this full list, and then we always heavily share it on our social media and our email newsletter as well.
Awesome. And my apologies, I'll make sure to do first and last names going forward. So I have here a question from Maria Roca. Seems that view corridors from the center of Governor's Island will be compromised by the height allowed by the proposed height allowances. How does this align with the historic human scale approach of the island's development in perpetuity? Thanks, Maria. Like one of the other questions, it definitely is a bit of a balancing act. And we really wanted to make sure to create enough open space to create connections both between the park and the water, and make sure that the sort of through sight lines were honored. And so there are some cases, obviously, where we've established limited places for increased height. We have worked very hard, of course, to honor the master plan for the island, which sort of called for the development sites to frame the view of the park, and as well to establish a transition zone along the northern part of the development sites to provide a more elegant, transition from the historic site as well. I should also note that the master plan that was created in 2010 really did study carefully key view corridors from within the park to make sure that at different locations within the park, even when the development zones were built, whether it be 10 stories or 20 stories, that you can still see through to the Statue of Liberty, to the Brooklyn Bridge, and to Lower Manhattan in key places.
And Claire, many of the view corridors, especially from within the park, are studied in the urban design chapter of our EIS, and so those can be looked at there.
I see a question here from Vilma Haramia. Have you considered developing a footbridge from the Brooklyn side? This could provide additional access to the island. For us, I think we're open to all ideas about access and connectivity. Right now, the stuff that we're relying on for our plan is ferry, because it's something that's within our control. And it's something that we can deliver on in the near term, increasing ferry access, increasing ferry frequency, expanding routes, that kind of thing, which, again, is something the trust can deliver on, and something that we can deliver on quickly for our visitors and for hopefully future tenants as well. And I have a question here from Ariel Krasnow. How will the RFP approach building construction, operations, and performance standards above and beyond building codes so that it reflects the overall mission of the development? Thanks, Ariel. That's another topic that has come up quite a bit. We actually have a working group of the CAC devoted to design guidelines, which are inclusive of sustainability and resiliency guidelines. This is an area where we really do want to push the envelope and be very aggressive, particularly around the energy side of the house. But we've in particular heard calls to make sure that the buildings are sensitive to honestly, the sort of like ecosystem that has developed on the island with respect to expanding green space, making sure they're bird sensitive, and really a whole slew of different concerns. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to lay out in this future RFP and basically say to respondents, listen, we want you to not just check the boxes, don't just hit building code, but like go above and beyond and show folks what is truly innovative in this space. But that's an area that we care a lot about and see as core to the mission of this project. I think, Rick, that I have caught up on the Q&A window and the chat window.
So
Thank
let's
you guys for all these
open it.
questions. It's great.
Yeah, no, thank you. So let's open it up to
Oh, Rick, I think you might have accidentally gone on mute.
oh, sorry. Let's open it up to questions from the proverbial floor. So who has questions? Maybe
Yeah, if you put it in the chat, if you'd like to speak, I'm happy to unmute folks, or if you raise your hand, that's fine too.
And I'll take this time, I sort of alluded to it, but just to let folks know that Allison Brown from Department of City Planning is on as well if folks have specific zoning questions or other things like that.
do we have other questions? I guess I would like to press, if we don't, I would like to press a little bit more on when you can commit to Red Hook Ferry for this upcoming year, what you're weighing there, and really that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Certainly by the spring, we like, honestly, everyone have been trying our best to make it through this past public season, which sort of stretched everybody to the brink, and are still grappling with the budget repercussions for that. Frankly, part of the reason we are trying to create a path to financial self-sufficiency is we, like everyone else, is also subject to city budget cuts, and all of that stuff is happening very live and in real time. But it is certainly our goal to be able to serve Brooklyn robustly this season. So we do need a couple more months because the budget situation is just changing live like every minute.
Are there things that we can do to help maximize the possibility of the Red Hook side?
Sure. Sarah, ideas, thoughts? I give Sarah the hard questions.
I mean, I think we are always trying to expand ferry service. So to the extent that you're having conversations with local elected officials around this, I know this is something that State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, whose staff I think is on the call, cares deeply about. So I'm continuing to voice your support there. And then I think most of you all know that we are part of the NYC Ferry Network as well. So we have heard a lot of ideas around expanding NYC ferry connectivity. So that's something that we're going to continue to work with our partners at EDC on and with the city. But I think that's another area where we see a lot of potential in having more direct connectivity to other waterfront neighborhoods in the city, including Red Hook.
Okay, and on that, if you can make sure to connect with members of the Red Hook business community,
Mhm.
since there is a real desire to have the ferry also support the foot traffic in ways that
Yeah.
support the businesses.
Definitely, yeah, we, members of my team got to know some of the businesses as well in their flyering efforts, but we see a lot of connectivity there with all the ferry stops, you know, both previous partnerships with Brooklyn Bridge Park and Pier 6, but Red Hook as well.
Great. Do we have other questions, or do we want to wrap up? It's the last chance for any other questions. All right, going once, going twice. Gone.
Thank you
So,
for coming.
well, yeah, thank you for coming. We very much appreciate it. Sounds like there are some follow-up items in terms of some of the detail of ridership on the ferry. And there were a number of other questions I saw you tracking. So anything else you need from us?
No, I will say, you know, let us know. We'd be happy to talk with the Parks Committee as well. And then, you know, Rick, when the world allows for such things, we would love to have you all back out to the island for a tour, or we could even do a masked, socially distanced one in the nearer term. Yeah.
Great. Okay. You should have a kayak dock for Red Hook, given proximity.
You have to really,
Yeah,
you have to paddle hard across the Buttermilk Channel.
But we do have a kayak dock during the season, so you know, maybe too, we can come back before we reopen next year to give an update and spread the word.
Oh yeah,
about
that's a good
the
idea.
island reopening.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you again. Seriously, we really appreciate it. All the thoughtful questions, and again for having spent 2 hours in your evening with us. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your time and
Yeah.
great presentation and
Thanks.
discussion.
Happy holidays. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
you
Everybody.
too. Bye.